Hi, I'm Vikki Hill. I'm the Project Associate for Changing Mindsets at University of the Arts London, and I'm delighted to once again welcome Dr Gurnam Singh, Principal Lecturer in Social Work at Coventry University and Visiting Fellow in Race and Education at UAL. Welcome.
No, thank you very much, Vikki.
Great. Gurnam, today I wanted to just frame our conversation around the Changing Mindsets intervention. So I'll just talk a little bit about that, which is the Changing Mindsets is a HEFCE funded project that began this year. And it's an intervention which is focused on closing the attainment differentials for Black, Asian, minority ethnic and working class students. And it's based on Carol Dweck's theories of implicit intelligence, and it aims to develop a growth mindset in both students and staff to avoid a student deficit model and to alleviate the negative effects of stereotype, threat and implicit bias as barriers to learning. So we're working with Professor Patricia Devine, who's a special advisor on the project, who from the 1980s has demonstrated that people exhibit implicit or unintentional racial bias that can influence behaviour, even in those who don't explicitly or consciously support racial stereotyping. And her work is about developing bias habit-breaking interventions and providing the tools needed to break habits. And then we also draw upon the work by Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson on stereotype threat. So from the mid-90s, their work has shown that stereotype threat can affect our actions and performance, and it refers to the risk of confirming a negative stereotype about a group into which you belong, or alternatively about the risk of not conforming a positive stereotype about a group to which you belong. And the studies that they have carried out have demonstrated how stereotype threat can have a substantial impact on student attainment and on performance. So Gurnam, I was just wanting to ask you really to sort of expand on this in terms of your own research.
Well, I will do it. I think it's important just to kind of maybe put a bit more meat on the bones for these three concepts that we're working with. One is, of course, changing mindset and implicit bias and stereotype threat. And they are all, connected very much, talking about the same thing. But if we just kind of begin with implicit bias, I think we can all agree that we all possess all kinds of biases, and we harbour stereotypes about any number of things. There's nothing wrong with that. Most psychologists would say that bias is quite a normal aspect of human functioning. And because it will be impossible for us to constantly assess sense information, our minds create what we call heuristics or mental shortcuts that ease cognition and make decision-making easier. For example, another kind of way of framing this is to talk about, we use a rule of thumb, or we should talk about an educated guess or an intuitive judgment, or even a guesstimate. We say, this is my guesstimate. And stereotyping, another concept in sociology is common sense. We use a common sense kind of approach. So implicit bias is a form of unconscious bias, where we make judgments about others that don't stand up to reason. And that's the key thing. Examples, common example, women are bad drivers, men are natural leaders, Black people are dangerous, and those kind of things. Yeah. And actually, there is an online test, the Harvard implicit bias test, which is called Project Implicit, and anybody can Google that and do the test for themselves. So that's implicit bias. I think changing mindsets is also, it has a kind of a scholarship research base of its own, and that research has a longish history in the US particularly, and in the UK more recently. And it was a kind of attempt by progressive educators, particularly in secondary education. I don't think it's only recently touching higher education. It was associated with this attempt to improve attainment levels of students by confronting these kind of stereotype, typical views, common sense views, that intelligence particularly was fixed. It's a characteristic, almost in the DNA, and that it was challenging this view. And for them, you can change people's sense of intelligence or their capabilities through student effort and pedagogy. It wasn't a kind of a destiny. The other concept is stereotype threats, and all the kind of major studies on sociology of education. We could go to Bourdieu's work, Bowles and Ginty's, Bernstein's work, and even people like Willis, and more theoretical work of people like Paulo Freire. And the work of Rosenthal and Jacobson is really important, who argued that the experience of schooling and university only valorizes the experience of students of the most privileged background, white male upper class, and then does the opposite for those that don't fit those kind of categories. And one of the things that can impact a student's performance, particularly in the context of race, gender and class, is what Claude Steele, and you mentioned Claude Steele earlier on, who's a psychology professor at Berkeley, has termed stereotype threat. And Steele defines this as the experience of anxiety or concern in a situation where a person has the potential to confirm a negative stereotype about their social group. But in contrast to Rosenthal and Jacobson's work, I think Steele focused on the impact that stereotypes had on individuals. I mean, Rosenthal and Jacobson were talking about impact on teachers and how they then made assumptions about students and performance, yeah? Steele was more concerned with the impact of stereotypes on students themselves. And what he found that wherever race was emphasized, then black students consistently did less well than white students, therefore confirming the suggestion that performance can be negatively impacted by the prevalence and awareness of racial stereotypes, yeah? So that's really kind of the background to some of these ideas, yeah?
Fantastic. So when we're thinking about this, and what are the implications for the university? So we know obviously through Steele's work about how students are affected, but also thinking about academic staff. How might this impact upon them? This work.
Well, I think this notion of internalization, I think that's an important thing, and I think institutions can internalize these stereotypes, typical kind of ideas, common sense views. And of course, students do themselves. So because the idea of innate intelligence somehow correlates with educational attainment, and that's so embedded within kind of society and higher education culture, strategies confronting this common sense view have got to be multi-layered. I think, that's the first thing. I think for universities, they have to approach this at every kind of level. So, and as you know, until relatively recently, any interest in growth mindsets and implicit bias will have been confined to kind of specialist interests in educational psychology or maybe teacher education. But now there is a kind of a much broader attempt to focus on attainment and closing gaps. Changing mindsets is seen to be one of the many strategies that appear to have a good evidence base, yeah? It means challenging the mindsets of staff, I think, both academic and support staff, who may have internalized ideas about innate intelligence, about other people of other races, yeah? And of course, that could be internalized negatively, because if you're stereotyped yourself negative, then you'll internalize a negative stereotype. Gender and class stereotypes also kind of come often be at play here. So far, universities have been doing some work on implicit bias, which is a good starting point. But for me, this work needs to go much deeper. At the moment, we've moved, as I say, from what I would call unconscious bias to conscious bias. Okay, so it's progress, but bias is still there. And I think what we need to do is we need to move towards what I would call conscious non-bias, and then ultimately to unconscious non-bias. Yeah, and so I think there are kind of stages that we need to go through.
And how would you foresee that happening then? What would be your idea, your vision for ways forward?
Okay, I think universities need to nurture a new world view. I think that we are looking for a paradigm shift where the idea of innate, bounded and fixed intellectual ability becomes totally redundant. I think that and that affects the way we select students, the way we define, construct curricula, the way we talk about the university experience. We still have this tendency to talk in elite terms, in terms of high and low and all those kind of things. I think we need to, in some senses, the work on closing attainment gaps is also trying to take us away from, paradoxically, this notion of attainment as in terms of gaps themselves, yeah? Because and that every individual, in a sense, needs to be judged on their own kind of contributions that they make, yeah? I think for students, and by the way, I think we need a lot of sensitivity and skill in working. I don't think that you can, as it were, force people to drink the water. Drink the water. You have to convince them that drinking the water is a good thing for them. Yeah, and I think that, and in universities, because we have people who have high levels of critical thinking, of reasoning skills, we need to engage with them at the critical level, at the level of evidence and reason, not just emotion.
Yeah. Can I ask you more on that? I know in your essay about intellectuality, student attainment, and the contemporary higher education system, you delivered an intervention that was student based about developing intellectuality and how that reduced stereotype threat. Do you have any other case studies or interventions, perhaps with staff, that that you think are have had positive effects or are particularly interesting?
Well, we had a case study where we did that research because we were trying to, as much as we could, try to replicate Jacobs and Rosenthal's studies about, where if you give some information to teachers about the ability of students and how that then impacts the way in which they might judge them. But it's difficult to replicate that study because of ethical problems. But what we did do is that we took a group of postgraduate certificate lecturer students, lecturers who are new lecturers, and we split them into two groups. And we gave each group a sample of essays to mark, and it was the same sample. So we simply just replicated the same sample with the two groups. The only difference that we did is in one sample, we tried to suggest that this was written by people who maybe were not from an English background, as it were, whose language might be different, or there were some hints that these people might not be white English ethnicity, but they were superficial. There was nothing to do with the content of the arguments. But what was really interesting, there was about when we took the averages of the marks and everything, there was about a 15 to 20% difference in the marks allocated. Yet these were essentially the same pieces of work. So that was an implicit bias. It was assumptions that were made based on certain kind of messages that were being taken.
Sure, great.
So, that's there really. I think, the evidence is there. And I think that we can do this work, with colleagues. It doesn't have to, we don't have to get into any complex kind of methodology, I think.
So what would be your three sort of takeaway points, three points for moving forward in this kind of work? What would they be?
I think that we've got to try and, go for a win-win situation. I think the first point is to communicate this work, not as if somehow this is robbing Peter to pay Paul. I think that if we're going to be, confronting stereotypes is really about being more objective in the way in which we assess. Because stereotypes, in a sense, compromise our objectivity. So I don't think that's necessarily against the kind of the broader culture of higher education, which is to try and be more rigorous and more objective. I think that's the first thing. I think, what are the main barriers in alleviating the effects of stereotype threat or implicit bias, and how can these be addressed? That's the first thing we need to focus on, And, James Baldwin noted that most human beings possess, and I'm quoting, a rigid refusal to look at themselves. And I think, sadly, I think academics are probably the worst at that. We always look at the students, but we don't look at ourselves now. So I think we need to, we talk about reflective practice, but I think we need to take reflective practice beyond this sense of, well, I did this and I did that. I think we need to then situate our reflections within new paradigms. I think that's really important.
Right.
And so, I think that those things, so they're attitudinal changes. And I think we need to present evidence in as transparent and as clear way to academics, because certainly, I would like to think that if nothing convinces academics, evidence would.
Yeah. Okay, Gurnam, thank you very much. I just want to finish there and say thank you for joining us, and also for those watching. You can find out more information about this from the Changing Mindsets website, which is mindsets.port.ac.uk. There's a blog there where you can post questions and comments and find out more about Gurnam's work as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vikki.
Thanks.